All right, so you got the official warning there. It's 4:01. I'm going to wait a little while yet because we don't have our full complement of folks assembled yet.
The baby is my wife's home, so baby's with her for the moment. I get the pleasure of moving later today, so I'll get to watch him probably. Well, not probably. I'll get to watch him tomorrow.
So Robin, Andrew has a young baby, and we start every meeting by kind of checking up on how the baby's doing.
Well, we're happy to see baby in this event. Babies, pets, whatever else you could do to keep us all attentive on a Friday afternoon seems worthwhile.
Okay, well, I'm very cognizant of time, and so I'm going to get us started. So maybe if everybody could mute yourselves for the time being, so we don't have any extraneous background noise. I'm hearing some right now. And a reminder that next week we are going to have Frank Cohen give a presentation on Infogram, because Infogram was one of the tools that came up highest on the survey. So you can look forward to that next week. This week we have another guest speaker, and I'm very happy to talk a little bit about Robin DeRosa. Robin's going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll do the same thing we did last week, where we'll open it up for questions via the chat function, and I'll pass them on to her. So Robin DeRosa is the director of the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative at Plymouth State University, right here in New Hampshire. The Open CoLab is a dynamic, Praxis-powered hub dedicated to innovative teaching and learning and a community-driven approach to academic professional development that focuses on instructional design, open education, interdisciplinary learning, and increasing the public impact of the academy. Robin graduated with a dual degree in English and Women's Studies from Brown and received her PhD in English from Tufts. A recognized authority on open educational resources, Robin joins us today to discuss possibilities and challenges of OER. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Robin.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me on Friday afternoon. I keep going back to that. It's really impressive that you're all here, especially during this semester. I don't know how you all are doing, but our faculty are exhausted. I mean, really, really challenged by these times. So I just want to thank you for not just hanging in there, but for doing extra, because it's a really hard time, I think, to do extra. With that, I'm going to share my screen, which will probably make it harder for me to share, to see the chat. So don't hold back. Go ahead and use the chat as much as you want. But I'll wait till after I finish the slides to kind of go into that stuff with you. And if anybody needs anything, or if I mess something up or you can't see me or whatever, please just unmute yourselves and jump in. So I'm going to talk about open educational resources and also about open pedagogy today. And I'm going to kind of do some baseline stuff just to catch us all up so that we're on the same page. And it may not be new for a lot of you, and some of you it might be new, but I want to go kind of quickly at the beginning. But some of this is really explains how I came to OER as a faculty member in English, not somebody who had particularly paid attention to these issues before. This is a slide from the New England Board of Higher Education, NEBI, that you might be familiar with NEBI, and they looked at tuition and fees at four-year institutions across New England. And you can see really here how much of tuition and fees were covered by the Pell Grant for students in the lowest of income brackets in 2013 to 14 versus 2018 to 19. Basically, what we're seeing is the shrinking, in some ways, power of the Pell, but the increased tuition demands that are falling to students and their families. So it's probably no surprise to you that college affordability is a challenge, and I'm sure your college is spending a lot of time talking about that, but faculty don't always spend a lot of time talking about college affordability. And I think I was one of the people who really didn't spend a lot of time talking about that until I started thinking about it as part of my job as a faculty member, as an academic. And so I want to sort of talk a little bit about how I got to that place. And reading the book Paying the Price by Sarah Goldrick-Rab was one of the ways that I came into this work. And you can see a lot of statistics on this slide that I think are fairly overwhelming. A year, for example, at a public university ranges from 16 to 25% of a middle-class family's annual income. That's pretty significant. She also talks here about food insecurity, about things like 23% of low-income sophomores working a job between the hours of 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. So sometimes when you think about a student who falls asleep in your class, God help you if that's ever happened to you, I will say from experience, it's quite a terrible experience. But she's very sensitive to asking what kinds of pressures, especially economic pressures, are our students facing when they are trying to go out and get an education. The one I really want to look at here is in yellow in the middle, that 50 to 80% of the sticker price for college comes from non-tuition costs. What that means, and actually the lower your school tuition is, the more true this is, but between the fees and the books and all the other things that your students need to cover in order to come to school, sometimes that can be childcare if they're parents, but sometimes that can just be transportation, also lost opportunity costs, right? The money that they lose from work hours when they decide to come to college. So particularly students at the lower income levels are really challenged by these non-tuition costs. And what we can see is that if we pay attention to non-tuition costs, not just tuition, we can make a really significant dent in the cost of what college is charging for students. So you probably already know that we'll be interested to a certain degree in textbooks here, although I want to remind you that as an English professor, we really didn't use textbooks. So I don't think you have to care about textbooks to be interested in where this PowerPoint is ultimately going to go. But in general, textbook costs have been rising much faster than the consumer price index. And actually, if you look at the cost of healthcare mapped on a chart, you'll see that that line is not rising as fast as the textbook cost line. So textbook prices have been going crazy. The Economist has called this price gouging. But over the past 4 decades, the price of textbooks has tripled for our students. And we actually have some pretty good data that our students worry more about paying for books than they worry about paying for college. This is probably because when it comes to paying for college, our students have plans, right? They either have student loans or they maybe have parental support. But when it comes time to going in the bookstore or going online to order their books, these are often costs that they did not anticipate and that they don't have a plan for. So they end up either putting it on a credit card with really large interest, or they just don't purchase them at all because they can't afford them. And we can see the impact of these costs on what we sometimes call student success. And this was the actual slide. This one is from 2016, although this study was also replicated in 2018 with pretty much the same details, with the same results. But this slide is what really woke me up as a faculty member, because I realized it wasn't just that books were expensive, it's that in a social justice sense, the cost of learning materials was shutting people out from college. They were not able to succeed or persist, partially because of these book costs. We have almost half of students reporting, this is 22,000 students in this survey, and about half of them reporting that they routinely took fewer courses because they couldn't afford the cost of learning materials. We know that when students take fewer courses and complete fewer credits, they extend their time to graduation. And we know that as they extend their time to graduation, they actually make it less likely that they will ultimately graduate. So these are really, like, I don't know if you guys at Franklin Pierce are having like retention task force meetings and, you know, just talking about retention all the time. But if you are, this slide should really make you start sweating a little bit, right? Because this is what we're talking about when we're talking about retention. We have students who drop and withdraw from courses, 26 and 20% respectively, simply because they couldn't afford the learning materials. Students report that they fail or get bad grades. And of course, that one at the end there, that 2/3 of our students report that sometimes they don't buy the book simply because they can't afford it. It surprises no faculty members to hear that, because you're always in a class where you've got at least a small cohort of students over on the side who just haven't purchased the book. Either they say, I gotta wait a couple of weeks for my check to clear, or I'm hoping to get paid soon, or I'm borrowing it from Joe. I'm gonna try to get it from the library. I have an old version. These are all the things that our students do, but what we see from this slide is that it's not just about whether or not they can get the book, it's about what that effect has on the way they succeed or don't succeed in college. So lots of you probably already aware that if you teach like an entry-level course at a freshman or sophomore level course in a discipline that is taught at most American colleges, the textbooks that you probably use in those courses are already available for free to your students from groups like OpenStax. There are many different OER organizations that offer these books. They are peer reviewed, just like regular books. They are created by academics. They are edited. They are often grant funded. So like Davis and Hewlett and Gates dumped millions of dollars into these. So they're really high quality materials. So if you teach, for example, stats or anatomy and physiology or US history or physics, and you just use a regular textbook, like a commercial textbook, I just don't think there is any ethical excuse for not checking out these open resources. It might take you, you know, a semester to get used to them, because it's always a pain in the butt to change your textbook. But once you do, your students will be able to access these for free online, or you can order them just like a regular textbook and have them brought to your college bookstore, bound and printed, and they'll look just like regular textbooks, and all your students will pay for is the cost of that printing. So that's great if you do teach in one of these, you know, not just the ones shown here, but any kind of commonly taught course. There are other disciplines, of course, where it's more challenging to curate your OER, because you might be teaching more at the upper levels or in a specialized discipline. That OER likely also exists, but you might have to put in some more legwork to put that all together. And those of you who've already started that work, you know that that's quite a challenge that we can talk more about as well. But what we're really talking about here is the access to knowledge that all of our students deserve. And the statistics really tell us that if we make these access decisions to change to OER, we are going to see results in our classes. So this study in 2016 was actually a study of studies. So they looked at all the studies that compared OER use against commercial textbooks. And they found that students who use OER perform significantly better on course throughput rates than peers who use traditional textbooks, whether it's face-to-face or online learning. So the throughput rate is an aggregate. So it measures how often students drop or withdraw from courses. And when you switch to OER, that goes down. And how often they get C or better grades. And that number goes up when you switch to OER. More interestingly, we can see that these benefits are actually augmented for vulnerable learners. So if you have, for example, at Franklin Pierce, diversity initiatives, where you're thinking about equity and inclusion across your curriculum, we have really solid data that shows that the bumps in throughput rates are going to be more pronounced for students from underserved categories, particularly minority students and Pell eligible students. This study out of the University of Georgia found that there was a 1/3 reduction in the drop, failure, and withdrawal rate for minority and Pell eligible students in courses that used OER. So I think what we're seeing here is, not just general student success, but particularly student success that really takes into account equitable learning environments. So sometimes you'll hear faculty say, oh, the OER is not very high quality, so I'm not going to use it. The data does not support that. There is some OER that is not high quality, just like there are many commercial textbooks that are not high quality. So the way to analyze quality is really based on peer review and your own critical review of the material. But what we can see is that that OER absolutely makes a difference to student success. And a lot of these studies are controlled studies, so they use the same matching assessments for the OER sections and the non-OER sections, and the students in the OER sections perform more strongly. So we are talking here about textbook cost, but what I really suggest you think about if you're starting a cohort and you're working in open education is to think less about textbook costs, which is not a super inspiring rallying cry, and instead think about access broadly writ. If you care about making learning more accessible to more students, then it's not just textbook costs that you're going to care about, but textbook costs can be a part of that. So when we rolled out OER in our interdisciplinary studies program, so first I'll tell you, this is a program at Plymouth State where students customize their own majors. And we tend to have a very large number of students who are come to interdisciplinary studies as they are failing out of other majors, and they are getting ready to drop out of school, and they stop into our customized program just on the way out, out the door. We rolled out an all OER curriculum in our core courses in interdisciplinary studies, but we did that at the same time as we did some other things. We started, for example, we have a large food pantry at Plymouth State, but you can see we started this little tiny food pantry right outside my office in interdisciplinary studies. That was part of our signaling to say, look, we know books are expensive, but we also know that you're facing a range of other challenges. And as your academic program and your academic hub, we want to be involved in assisting you through all of your challenges in learning. So we started resourcing ourselves with information about food insecurity and housing insecurity, book costs, transportation. We started worrying about lack of access to broadband and digital devices. We started looking at flexibility in our curriculum. All sorts of things we started changing at the same time as we changed to OER. So I can't say it's just the OER, but I will say that since 2014, our major has grown. We've existed here since 1974, but in 2014, we put all of this stuff into place. And from 1974 to 2015, we averaged 10 students a year in this very kind of oddball program. Now we have 120 students in this major. It's one of the largest majors at Plymouth State. And even though we serve mainly students who are in academic jeopardy, we have an almost 100% retention rate in the program. Almost nobody leaves. By that, I mean, in the last 5 years, I could name on one hand the students who have left, all for good reasons. But this stuff will make a difference. And so for me, talking with faculty, a lot of it is about saying, hey, we're used to being scholars and experts in our field. But when we just look at our content, we are starting to shortchange a lot of students who can't access our material because of all of these other challenges. So thinking about OER as a holistic part of paying attention to your students' real lives can be really fantastic. But the part of open that I really want to talk about today, maybe we can talk about most in the discussion, is that open gives students not just access to knowledge, but access to knowledge creation. The idea here that I think most of you are probably aware of is that an openly licensed material is not just free, right? There's all sorts of stuff on the internet that you can share for free with your students, and that's great, but that's not OER. So I encourage you to use it. But what makes something OER is that it's openly licensed with a Creative Commons license. It sits on top of copyright. So the material is still copyrighted to whoever created it. But this Creative Commons license gives what we call the 5R permissions, right? It gives these extra permissions to the people who use the material. So not only can they retain or reuse or redistribute the material to anybody they want, but they also get the chance to revise the material or remix it for their purposes. So for faculty, this could mean something as simple as taking a chemistry textbook and taking out chapter 4 and replacing it with a chapter 4 from another textbook that you think did it better, or adding your own question sets to each chapter, for example, so you can do little revisions like that. Or it can mean involving your students in thinking about the learning material as something that they can participate in. So I want to talk a little bit about those kinds of pedagogies that can accompany a material that is licensed with the 5Rs, because it's really, for me, about, if we start with the cost of books, not very interesting. Then we get to the idea, okay, OER can make a difference in book costs. That's important. But if I care about that kind of access to knowledge, I should care about more access to knowledge. So I'm going to care about a whole bunch of things that my students need in order to access the materials. But once they can access the materials, I don't just want them to be able to download information from a whole bunch of sources. I want them to see themselves as participants in the knowledge community, as people who ultimately have something to contribute, even if they're just introductory students. The idea here is that that knowledge should welcome diverse voices, and that our students should feel empowered to participate in their scholarly and professional communities. So open pedagogy cares both about access to knowledge, but also about access to knowledge creation. So I'm going to tell a little story here. What you see on your screen is the start and the end of the story. So up in the top left, you can see the Heath Anthology of American Literature. The Heath costs, I think, maybe about $85 or something. So as textbooks go, it's actually pretty cheap. But when I was teaching with the Heath, one of the things I realized is that all of the literature in the early American textbook that I was teaching was literature from 1400 to 1800. So if you know anything about copyright law, you know that literature from 1400 to 1800 is primarily in the public domain. It's out of copyright. So what that means is that my students were paying like 85 bucks for American literature that was basically in the public domain. And I thought, that is such an American thing, right? That we would charge our students all this money for basically free literature. So once I learned about Creative Commons and open licensing, I thought, you know, I bet I could get a group together and we could recreate this book for free so that people don't have to pay all this money. So I made a little Google spreadsheet, and I got about 10 students involved over the course of one summer. And the 11 of us just went out and started finding the open versions of, you know, Thomas Jefferson and Toussaint Louverture and all the people who are in the Heath Anthology. Over time, we built and by over time, I mean in about 2 months, we built the open anthology of earlier American literature, a free online replacement for the Heath. And my students came in that next fall to the class. A couple of the students actually had helped me build the book, and they were super excited. And I was like a hero at first, right? Because there was an English class, no cost at all, everybody's psyched. And then we started using the book. And that's when it kind of all fell apart, because the students hated this book. And I will tell you the reason. The real Heath Anthology had all sorts of stuff in it that was designed to help learners. So it had maps, it had illustrations, a glossary, footnotes, and most of all, it had these introductions to every document that you would read that would kind of tell you what's important about it, right? So for students who were a little bit nervous, it was really a helpful kind of scaffold. So I thought, oh great, we just built this replacement, you know, it really can't replace this other material. Until we had our kind of aha moment when the students and I realized that the students could build out all of those materials in the Heath. So what we have here is Hannah Hounsel, who was a student in my class. She wrote an introduction to Christopher Columbus. She wrote it about 2 weeks before the rest of the class got to Columbus. So we were able to put that in the book. And by the time the class got there, they were able to access Hannah's introduction. Hannah's introduction was better than the critical introduction in the Heath. And the reason is Hannah understood exactly what undergraduate students did not understand about Christopher Columbus. So she was able to speak in their language, peer to peer, and the students found it incredibly helpful. And that's when we started getting super excited. Students started building short video introductions. This is Jonathan. Jonathan would do little 2-minute video introductions to every historical period that we had to cover. And we would just dump those right into the textbook. So here he is talking about the Haitian Revolution. You know, here's what you need to know. Here's what you need to understand. I layered a little app in the sidebar called Hypothesis, which allowed my students to take notes together in the sidebar of the digital textbook. The students got super excited. They were putting GIFs in there. They were putting images. They were asking each other questions, defining terms for each other. At the end of the semester, the folks from Hypothesis, who had just started this app at the time, they were beta testing it with our students. They told me that our class of 18 students had put 10,000 annotations into this textbook that we created. And I am pretty sure they were not putting 10,000 annotations into the Heath Anthology of American Lit. So the textbook really became just a joyful place full of life and full of student work, and also full of all of the same content that we needed to cover. The next semester I changed departments, and I was kind of heartbroken because I was like, this is the best thing I've done in 20 years of teaching, and now I got to, you know, go to another program. But my colleague Abby, who took over the class, she basically made a copy of my anthology because it's all openly licensed, and she made a new version of it with her students who greatly improved it. After a while, the word got out about Abby's book and my version. And so people all over the country started to use it in place of the commercial textbooks. And Tim Robbins at Graceland University picked it up and actually engaged about 20 academics using a grant from the Hewlett Foundation. And that version of the Open Anthology is probably going to come out at the end of this year. It's got a massive table of contents. So over here, you can see my table of contents, and this is Tim's table of contents, all peer reviewed. Some of my students' original work has stayed in the anthology. But what's so exciting about this project is that not only did we reduce the cost of learning materials for students in early American literature, but we really showed that you don't have to create a perfect OER, and your students don't have to be amazing scholars in their field in order to make contributions that really move the field forward. So it was a really exciting and an awesome project to be a part of, which is non-disposable. So one of the things we talk about in open, especially open pedagogy, is instead of creating projects and assignments that are destined for the delete bin or the trash can, how can you get your students really contributing in ways that will last past the course? So just to kind of recap, when we think about open pedagogy, we certainly think of accessibility. That can be everything from the cost of the textbook to accessibility that allows students, whether they are hearing impaired or low vision, to access the course. Certainly, we've thought about access in terms of access to connectivity during COVID. That's been a big issue. So keeping access in the front is a big part of pedagogical design around open pedagogy. But also thinking about curriculum that is learner-driven, that instead of downloading information into students' brains, we think about students participating more in their educations, getting to make more decisions about where they are headed, and really being treated to a certain degree as young colleagues in their field. And then finally, we think about connection. The coolness of open is that it is built on the idea of a sharing economy for knowledge. So if knowledge is designed to be shared, how can we connect our students' work to the larger knowledge economy so that they too are sharing the good things that they do, and so that they are becoming connected to the fields that they're going to graduate into. So when it's time to get a job, they don't have to go into career services in some binder somewhere. They've already made colleagues. They've already been working. They've already been contributing. There's a great quote by David Wiley, who is a big guy in open education, and he says, using OER without open pedagogy is a little bit like taking a jet plane and driving it down a highway. Like, sure, a jet plane can drive down a highway, but it can do so much more. So when we think about the open license, I like to suggest to faculty that you think about the ways that that license can change the kinds of assignments that you're doing and the ways that you build your course. So I'm going to give some examples of open pedagogy projects that people have undertaken. A good example that sometimes seems overwhelming to faculty is working with Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a great alternative to throwing away your research paper. If you're going to do research for a class that's good, then you may as well consider writing that kind of research for an audience who could actually use it. But lots of faculty don't know how to edit Wikipedia, or they think, oh God, that's like a tech nightmare. So I just wanted to let folks know that there's a group called WikiEDU. They are a nonprofit that will work with you individually for free, helping you design an assignment for your class. It could be anything from a 2-day assignment where you're doing some very small editing thing to a large-scale full semester research project. They will teach you and your students all the technology that you need in order to work with Wikipedia. The idea here is that if knowledge is meant to be shared, and if Wikipedia is a resource that's kind of the go-to resource for lots of scholars and students, that we want to empower our educational institutions to improve this resource. So WikiEDU is a really great resource, and also there are tons of studies that show that working with Wikipedia, and by that I mean not using it as a source, but contributing to it and engaging with it, actually does really amazing things for student learning. This goes back to the idea of non-disposability, when students believe the work that they are doing actually has impact. So there's lots of skills that come along with editing Wikipedia. Just one example of an open pedagogy project. Another is this from NOBA. NOBA is a psychology organization, and they do a lot of open education and OER, but they also sponsor this excellent video contest every year where they ask people to make short videos on different key psychological principles. And students are welcome to enter this video contest. All the videos that are submitted become openly licensed. That way faculty can use them, so they can add them to textbooks or just your Canvas or your Moodle, Blackboard, whatever. You're free to use all these videos. But students have the ability to create curriculum. These 2 students one year won the first place award, which was a $6,000 prize. So it's a really great way for students to do something they might have already done for your class privately, like make a video about something. But why not put that work out into the world? This is another example. This is a psychology textbook from BC campus. It's completely free to use online or really low cost if you choose to get it printed and bound. But Principles of Social Psychology did not come with a question bank originally. And that was kind of a problem. Lots of psych professors know that you like the ancillary materials and the question banks. Some textbooks in OER already have that stuff, but some of it's still being created. So this book didn't have it yet. So my colleague Rajiv Jangiani in Vancouver actually took 18 of his students one semester, and instead of answering questions from question banks, they created the question bank themselves. They wrote 1,800 questions in the course. I think it was 1,800, might have been 1,200. I don't know if it's on the slide, hold on. No, so they wrote a whole bunch of questions, over 1,000. And then the next semester, those questions went to the graduate program in psychology at their institution. The graduate students reviewed and vetted all of the questions they created. And then in the 3rd semester, it went to the computer science undergraduates who created the architecture of the test bank. So now this book comes with a test bank that was more or less completely student created. So the coolness of that is even creating the test bank was a way for students to learn, right? So you can do really cool things where you're augmenting these resources and involving your students in the work. Environmental Science Bite is from The Ohio State University. Undergrads took a regular commercial textbook in environmental science, and for every principle that the textbook covered, they wrote about current events that demonstrated the principles in the textbook. So this is an undergraduate written current events textbook that's updated now every semester by students. Your students can not only read these things, which are openly licensed, but they can also contribute to them. So you could create a version of this yourself. So it's a really wonderful open pedagogy project that you can either assign or create. Here in New Hampshire, Keene State is doing a lot with citizen science. So lots of their students are working in the community on community science projects, and they've created lots of websites where they are sharing that research and getting faculty, students, and the community to work together. Again, these are non-disposable assignments that can be shared with the public and which the public can participate in. So all of these are great examples of the kinds of open pedagogy projects that people are working on. And I wanted to talk briefly about the kinds of architectures that support work like that. So on one side of your screen, you see Alcatraz. And that, I don't know what LMS you guys use. Do you use like Moodle or Canvas, Blackboard? Canvas. Okay. So Alcatraz is Canvas. I mean, I'm all for the LMS. It has its place, but think about it this way. You put stuff in there, nobody gets in or out of Canvas who isn't supposed to be there, right? So like if you have a really cool thing you're doing in your class and you want to show your colleague, it's not the simplest thing, right? To sort of get your colleague into your Canvas. Your student work is all locked down in there. That's really great for certain kinds of discussions where you want some privacy or some safety. But it seemed to me that this resembled nothing that I was aware of in the real world that our students were going to graduate into. Why would we tell our students in our mission statements, we here at Franklin Pierce, we engage you in applied experiential learning in the world, get to know your fields, get to know your careers, and then we lock them in a prison where their work can never get out to influence anybody. So I thought what I really want to design with students are architectures where they like design a home of their own, and there's a highway or a path or a driveway that goes up to their door. So you can invite people in to collaborate on your work, and you can share that work with the world. So there's lots of different ways to do it. In our program, we use domain of one's own, which is basically a institutional system where we give new students in our program their own URL, and we help them design well, it is a website, but we call it an e-port. It's like a portal to the world. And in this portal, they can share work about what they're doing. They can keep connected through their social media channels so that their academic and extracurricular interests can be integrated in different ways. I don't think it's important that every student has a website or that you radically change all of your classes so that everything's open on the web. But think about OER as a way of inviting students into a conversation about how knowledge is shared and how knowledge is collaborative. That's really the goal of the open license, is to put something out there and allow people to improve it and use it freely. So for that reason, we really want to tie it to pedagogies that get our students sharing and collaborating as opposed to working in lockdown or isolation. So I have lots of examples of students talking about the shift in pedagogy. So when we shifted our interdisciplinary studies program, we were really explicit with students. We said, this is called open pedagogy. We are not going to be locked down in Moodle or Canvas anymore. We're going to be trusting you to do work that has impact, and we're going to facilitate your connecting to the places where you need to in order to have that work have impact. And as a result, some of our students who really had not found success or passion in college before really started to come alive. So we find that whether it's a student who really struggles or one of our students who is really excelling in customizing a major, they all do really well with this kind of approach. So I'm just going to end by talking a little bit about the domains of teaching that I had spent time in before open education. I think I mostly was in these 3 domains. The domain of knowledge, which is basically like, I have content about, you know, the Revolutionary War and you need to know it. So I was transferring knowledge. But I didn't want to just transfer knowledge. I also wanted my students to understand that knowledge, right? I wanted them to not just spit back what I said, but be able to say it in their own words and deeply understand it, and maybe even apply it, right? So they could take it in places that I hadn't anticipated and thrive with that information. And I think I taught like about 20 years in those 3 domains and felt pretty good about it. And I was pretty surprised when I started working in open to realize there were domains I had not even thought about. And the first was that survival domain. How could my students come to knowledge if they were hungry? How could they come to knowledge if they couldn't afford the textbook? How could they come to knowledge if their anxiety disorder was making it difficult for them to function in my class? So even though I am not a psychiatrist and I don't run a food bank of my own, I started saying it's up to me as a professor to know how to find resources for my students, to tell them that I believe these things are an academic issue, and to help them solve their challenges. In that sense, advising became a core part of what I did, holistic advising in my teaching. And then finally, on the other end, after they apply their knowledge, I don't want them to apply their knowledge in some kind of like, you know, inauthentic quiz question. I want them to apply their knowledge in the world, right? So how can I give them opportunities to actually contribute the knowledge to the real world, which will of course ultimately change the world, maybe only a tiny bit to begin. But the idea is not to train them for jobs as much as it is to give them the ability to contribute. So when they graduate, the world that they graduate into is in some ways shaped by the work that they have done, right? They're shapers of the world, not just people training for it. So that's kind of what open has meant for me. I'm going to skip through this last stuff, but I'm going to give you this slide deck so you can have all of the information. The citations are on the bottom of the slide deck. So I'll put that into the chat as soon as we finish. I do want to draw your attention to openpedagogy.org, which is a site that my colleague Rajiv and I started just for people to see examples of different kinds of open pedagogy projects from multiple disciplines. And if you've been doing something cool, especially as part of this cohort, we would love to feature you in the Open Pedagogy Notebook, so you can absolutely submit something that we will publish on there to share with other practitioners. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I can see there's some stuff in the chat, but I'm not super caught up. So I will say, I'm here. You can unmute, or we can ask stuff from the chat, or whatever you need. And I'm happy to show you. Don't feel hesitant about asking tiny questions about tech tools or big questions about mindset, whatever you want.
Yeah, why don't people put questions in the chat for right now? I think that might be easier than, because otherwise we find people unintentionally talking over each other and things like that. So that worked well last time. That's a great presentation, Robin. Thank you so much. I did put the link to openpedagogy.org in earlier in the talk, so I guess I anticipated you there, so that's nice. But let's see here. I'm gonna try to get caught up here. Blah blah blah.
I think I see Frank wants to unmute and ask a question.
Do you have a full? Do you? One person's asking about the institutional licensing for domain of one's own.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We do now have an institutional license. I don't know exactly, it's not unlimited, but we've got plenty for, so in my program, everybody uses it. Other programs use it in different ways. When I first started doing this work though, so I had to build a little bit of cred with domain of one's own. So when I first started doing this work, we didn't have an institutional license. My students just made free websites on the internet, and that was fine. Now we are able to give them the URL, and then when they graduate, they can migrate it to one of their own, or they can delete it. It's their choice. It's not super expensive. I mean, as you probably know, there's a bit of a budget crisis in higher ed. I don't know if you guys are feeling it as bad as we are, but I mean, we're in hell up here at Plymouth State, and I still have my license for this. I feel like it's in the $5,000 range for the institutional license, and it comes with a huge amount of, we have to do some back-end service, but they provide a lot of support. So I would say domain of one's own is excellent, but you don't necessarily want to jump into it. Get some people working with students on the web, build some, explore how you would use it in certain programs rather than just as one-offs. And once you have some ideas by department, say, that would be the time, I think, to move to an institutional thing. So we really built it over time independently, and then we moved to the institutional.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's possible we could try at least for 1 year to get domain of one's own with ideal money. So I will put that on my list. One participant asks, and I know this is a very common question and you touched on it a little bit, but how much extra work is it to teach like this? I think that's the #1 stumbling block with OER is people agree with the principles, but they get intimidated by thinking how much work this is going to be to create all this. So can you address that a little bit, Rob?
Yeah, let me say one other thing about domains too. The two people kind of created domain of one's own, but one of them is Martha Burtis, and she now works with me in the collab right here at Plymouth State. So if you decide to roll out domains and you need help, you can find her through me, but Martha is great and could do a lot to kind of advise you as you're trying to figure out your setups. She's really amazing. So the question of how much extra work it is, there's two pieces maybe to that. One is the OER, because even just on its own, OER can be, as you may be now aware, a hell of a lot of work. Because if you teach intro biology, lucky you go adopt OpenStax and you can save a huge ton of money immediately, right? Like, I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars by one faculty member over the course of just, a couple of semesters. But if you teach anything other than those intro courses, you're going to be looking more at curation. And one thing that's kind of cool about OER is that nobody owns it, which means it isn't all in one place that's easy to find. So what you really want to do is start with an OER librarian or make sure one of your librarians is getting good training. Oh, it's Katie, so there you go.
Katie Beth.
And they can help you with that. And usually the main thing I say about switching to OER is don't rush your commitment. So say, today I pledge to use OER. Once you do that, I don't care if it takes you a year, you're still going to save so much money over time. So take your time, do it right, work with a librarian. It doesn't have to be tomorrow. You can change out one thing at a time, change out one course at a time. Even if it takes you 5 years, think about the service that you're doing there. So that's the main thing with OER, work with a librarian and take your time. With the other stuff, I would say, and we have a thing at Plymouth that I can share with you. It's called the ACE framework, and it's basically a faculty development program in this kind of approach to teaching. But I would say get involved with a learning community if you can, whether it's on your own campus. For me, originally, it was through Twitter because I didn't feel like I had a lot of people doing this work. Now we have a huge learning community at Plymouth that meets regularly. But if you can put together a learning community, I think the best bet is to try to think about changing your mindset towards connected learning and access. So think about more connection for your students and more access for your students. Once you get that mindset in place, no one thinks it's a good idea for you to change everything all at once. You just want to get the mindset in place, and then you can start changing things as you go. The biggest thing I would say, though, is if you are a scholar, as I was originally, who basically works in isolation, right? I was an early Americanist. All of my work was alone with a book in my room. And you don't collaborate if you are not on the web, if you don't share your work, if you are not connected through social media, which doesn't have to mean Facebook, but media that brings scholars into conversation with each other. If you don't know how to do that, it's really hard to do it with your students. So maybe take next semester and say, you know what, I'm going to keep my courses the same. I might switch to OER, but I am going to start investigating what it looks like to be more of a public intellectual. I am going to start investigating what it means to share my work or openly license my work or find other scholars at other places who do what I do to collaborate with, because that's what we're trying to teach our students, but a lot of us are not super good at it yet. And there's no shame in that. Our institutions haven't trained us in that way. But there's really good techniques that we can use to teach you how to get connected as an educator. It's not a secret. You can be shown how to do that. So if you don't know how, maybe take a semester working with yourself in a connected learning environment before you bring students. You know, my least favorite thing is when faculty are like, all my students are going to blog this semester. And you're like, why? And they're like, I don't know. I heard blogs are the thing. Everybody has to blog. And then your students blog and no one reads their blogs. And everybody goes, why are we using all this technology that we can't even figure out? So before you jump into open learning, you need to figure out what's really in it. What's exciting here? Like, what's the magic? And once you practice with that a little bit, then we can bring our students. So maybe get a cohort if there's a few of you who want to do it. And find somebody who's got some knowledge. There's also lots of stuff around to help you do it, and learn together over a semester or so. And then the final thing I'll say is, we're in a global pandemic, people, and everybody's fried. Whatever you bite off, make it small and be gentle with yourself, because, you know, we've got time. But the payoff is big. You will see your students really appreciate learning in these ways that feel more authentic. And they will really appreciate it if you think about access as you're designing.
We've got a question from one of the participants saying, can you show us where your students edited a Wikipedia entry?
I cannot, because I haven't done WikiEDU, but I can show you some good examples. Let me see if I can get to the web. Hold on.
Lots of great links being shared in the chat, people, by the way. So don't forget about our wonderful OER LibGuide created by Katie Beth and others.
Okay, so I am trying to find this. It's called, I think, Murder, Mayhem, and Madness. Here it is. Okay, so here's, you know, I kind of hate to do this because it's like starting with the varsity project, but it's a really great one that basically took place in one semester by a course. So I would check that one out if you get time. It's in the chat. But I also want to remind people who are interested in Wikipedia, there's really tiny ways that you can get involved. Two examples that come to mind. One is a faculty member in women's studies whose students looked for articles about like women in politics or whatever, and they looked for places where the images were inappropriate to the article. So for example, there was an article on women in El Salvador, and the picture was a very suggestive photo of a woman, and the women's studies course looked at those places. They analyzed the photos, and then in cases where they found that the photos of women were not consistent with the articles, they simply replaced them. And you don't just replace stuff on Wikipedia, there's a whole editing process, but they suggested the replacements and edited them to be more appropriate. So that was a really little thing. We also have tech writing classes, for example, that can look at any content on Wikipedia, and they're not doing the research of the content, they're just editing for clarity, right? So if you teach composition or professional writing, you can do that kind of stuff as well, where people are just editing to improve. So another thing is that people will make infographics. Sometimes students are really good at making infographics or illustrations or whatever. You can add those to articles. So editing Wikipedia doesn't necessarily mean you have to, you know, start from scratch and create something completely new. But WikiEDU is a great resource to check out if you're interested in a small or a big thing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, there's been more sharing of links than out and out direct questions. And Frank is pointing out that he's been on board with OER for a long time, and I'm sure that's the case with a number of you as well. Anyway, one thing I'll point out about Wikipedia too is, I've published a lot, books, articles, etc. One of the hardest things I ever got published was a Wikipedia page. They are very stringent about what they accept. You have to prove all your assertions, with a link to back it up. I mean, so I think people are coming to terms with Wikipedia more than they were 5 or 10 years ago, when it was regarded as kind of as a joke. But Wikipedia is getting better and better and better, and it can be a very good background source for students. If you've ever looked at one of their pages, all the live links to sources that were used in the article can be tremendously helpful. So I hope there's isn't prejudice against Wikipedia these days.
Yeah, and that's really how I first started editing Wikipedia. Was there's places where they actually will have a note like citation needed, and so I was just learning how to edit by going off and retrieving different citations that they needed for different things. So there really are a lot of entryways. The thing about Wikipedia, and it's a great conversation to ask your class. I mean, there's no definitive answer to how good a source is Wikipedia, but there's a great kind of a conversation there about, does knowledge belong in just one book written by one expert, or is there something useful about getting many people contributing to the quality of something? There's different ways to produce quality, right? Like, one is by going as far as you can in your field and becoming the guy who knows the most. The other is by, many hands knowing a piece of many parts, right? So there's different ways to build projects.
Robin, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. I wanted to get to this one question. Could you show us an example of what you consider the best non-disposable work your students produce?
Yes, I am going to, this might take me 1 second, but I'm going to get there. So our interdisciplinary capstone course, every year in their ePorts that they've created, they do a research project and an applied project. So, I mean, they do a research article, multimedia research article, and an applied project, and all of these are shared out with the community. The applied projects are all kind of engaged, community work. And the research projects are like 20-page research papers, except they also have hyperlinks and video and graphs and whatever else. And the stuff that they produce is absolutely phenomenal. So I'm going to give you a page with some of those things, but it probably won't be super fast. I may actually just send it to you when I send you the slide deck.
Right. Yeah, you can send me the slide deck, Robin, and I can distribute it to the group, and then you can include that link there if that would be easier.
I will do it. It's really wonderful to see the stuff that they're doing, but you can also kind of browse the ePorts a little bit, because you can see sort of lots of projects. So I'll at least send you a few of those so that you can look at them. But again, openpedagogy.org that's what it's going to be, is a showcase of different professors who are doing these kinds of work. The other thing is that I'll put into the chat. I know a lot of people aren't on Twitter or think Twitter, disparage Twitter, but for open education, that is where I have learned like 90% of what I've learned, because there's lots of generous scholars who share there. So if you are in a particular field, it may not be exactly what I do. So I'm super happy on Twitter to connect you to open educators who are in your field. So feel free to find me there. Sometimes things get lost, so be persistent, but ping me and I can connect you to lots of other people. Because sometimes, like, if you do math, if you do chemistry, if you do French, it's more persuasive to hear from people who are doing the kinds of things that you're doing. We have, like nursing, languages, like whatever you do, I guarantee there's people who do this kind of learning in your field. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Robin has a 5:15 meeting, I think she told me before we
On
started.
Friday.
Yeah, so
The
yeah.
faculty, they're crazy.
But anyway, so I think we need to wrap things up, and it is 5:01. But anyway, thank you so much, Robin. That was tremendously helpful. And I will, cohort members, I will share the slide deck that she sends to me and anything else that she sends to me. And say hi to Phil for me, Robin.
I certainly will. And you know what? In the chat, I just put the slide deck, but I will send it again tomorrow to Paul with some of those e-ports that you can browse, and that'll get you started. But just remember, you know, it's all virtual now, but I really am just up the road from you, and I feel like so excited to be talking to other New Hampshire people. So just be in touch anytime, and if you want some domains help, remember we have Martha as well. So we're here.
All right. Thanks
All
so
right.
much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that concludes today's meeting. So next week we'll go back to tools, and we'll do infogram. And I just want to reinforce the idea behind these speakers is to sort of get our creative juices flowing. We try to do a combination of like tools and then discussions and speakers that just get us thinking and going places that we haven't gone before. So anyway, thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you next week.